darkness, set free from who we were, changed and changing still to be made in your image.
Hello everybody, it's great to see you all here at Radical tonight. Hope that you guys enjoyed our Nerf battle last week. We had just a lot of fun, just splitting up into teams, playing all kinds of different games, and just getting to relax and let off some steam. I know I'm sure it's been a stressful start of the school year, so hopefully that was a good thing for you guys. I know I had a lot of fun with it. But now we're heading into a new school year, and we're diving into really some more time to spend learning and growing together. And so we're coming out of our Jesus Imposter series, and we're heading into a new series called Living Like Elisha. And maybe that's a Bible character that's a little bit unfamiliar to some of you guys. That's okay. Maybe you've heard some of these stories before, but I'm guessing that a lot of them might be pretty new, or at least somewhat unfamiliar to you guys. So I'm excited about it. I think God can really use it as we look to this prophet in the Old Testament and get to look at his life and see what we can learn from him and how we can live today as followers of Jesus. So we'll go ahead and start off our lesson by having an opener question. So the question is, do you have a hard time with making big decisions? And go ahead and feel free to share a story with that if you'd like. So talk about that now with your small group. Sometimes big decisions are hard, right? I know that I've felt that before in my life. My college decision was one of those times. I've visited like at least 6 different colleges and just had a hard time seeing myself in that next stage of life and which college would be a good fit for me, where I could see myself growing and thriving. But ultimately, when it came down time to make the decision, I kind of waited until the last minute. But once I did, I picked Olivet, and it turned out to be the best place for me. So I know sometimes those big decisions can be hard, but sometimes as we follow God's leading, he ends up putting us in the best spot for us. And so we're going to talk about Elisha and a big decision that he faced in his life. So we're going to read our scripture now. It's from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 14 to 21. And instead of just listening to me read it or reading it on the screen, I want you guys to find a Bible. Someone in your group should have one. If not, track one down, use a smartphone, and have somebody read out loud from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 14 to 21. Pause the video, read it together, and then continue playing it once you guys are finished. What a cool story, right? You see Elijah come, this great prophet of the Lord. He's got some of the most well-known stories of a prophet in the Old Testament there. Probably some of those stories you're familiar with. But he's looking for an apprentice, someone to kind of take under his wing and train up in the ways of God and show them how to be a prophet. And he chooses Elisha, and it's kind of this low-key moment, but it's a big moment, and you can tell because of how Elisha responds, how big of a moment that was for him. So we're going to dive into this and talk about Elisha and how he received God's calling in his life. So the first thing we're going to talk about is about recognizing God's calling. It's something that's really important, but it's not always easy for us to do. So I have a question for you guys. Have you found it easy or challenging to discern God's leading in your life? It's challenging sometimes for us to really feel like, well, is this something that I want to do, or is this something that God is really leading me to do? And it can be kind of a tricky balance with that. And there's kind of, in the story with Elisha, there is a pretty clear calling from God because of the actions of Elijah, right? It's kind of this awkward moment, at least by today's culture, right? Where Elijah takes off his cloak and then he puts it on Elisha and then just walks away. It doesn't really talk about any words exchanged. Maybe there were, but at least by the scripture, it seems like it was just kind of like he walks up, puts his cloak on and walks away, right? But you can see that Elisha knew what this meant, and he recognized it as God's calling. God was calling him through Elijah to serve as a prophet, to be under Elijah's wing, to learn from him and to grow in the ways of what it means to follow God and to speak for God to his people. So it's a big deal to him. And really in our lives too, discerning God's calling is a big deal. We want to be on the lookout for that, and we want to be prepared and ready for when that comes. We want to be ready and waiting to follow whenever that moment comes that we see those whenever we see God's direction, whether it's in a big way, kind of like with Elisha in this moment here, where it literally changes his life, or whether it's in the small things where we sense God leading us in one way and we want to be ready and willing to follow at a moment's notice. So a quick example for this might be where you're sitting in class and your teacher calls on you, right? I know that especially with all the virtual learning going on, that might not be happening as much these days, but you remember those days, I'm sure. And it's whenever this scenario happens, whether you're paying attention or not is really key, because if the teacher calls on you and you've been paying attention with class and you're tracking along with the lesson, boom, you've got an answer right there. If you haven't been, what happens? I don't know. Or you say something that's totally off base, or you have to ask that teacher to repeat the question, right? So it's kind of the same situation as you think about following God's leading. If you're listening and in tune to what God's saying to you, and you're paying attention, and you're preparing yourself to be ready and willing to follow after what he calls you to do, then when it happens, you're not caught off guard, but instead you can respond and be ready and willing to follow how he's leading you, which I think is what we see happen here with Elisha. The second point is that we shouldn't hesitate to follow. When God calls us, we should be ready and just wanting to follow after passionately whatever he calls us to, because that's when we're living in his will, when we're following after what he wants for us. If he's calling us to something, we should take note, because it's a big deal. We shouldn't take it lightly, but should be ready to go without hesitation. So I have a question. What would you struggle to leave behind if God called you to something that meant giving it up? Talk about that with your group. There might be all kinds of answers you guys shared there, but that's our human nature. We cling to things of this world. There's things that we value over what God might have for us, and it makes it hard to follow his leading. But ultimately, we should be willing and ready at a moment's notice to leave behind those things and pursue what ultimately matters most, what matters for eternity, and that is following God and his leading for our lives. And you see Elisha do this in a really powerful way here in this story of his calling. He leaves behind his team of oxen in the field and literally runs after Elijah. So if you think about that situation, I don't know if you guys are probably not super familiar with like what that scenario would look like in terms of him guiding that team of oxen, but he's there and he's leaving them behind, and who knows what is going to go on with that team. They're dragging the plow along, and he's just going to abandon that team of oxen to go and follow Elisha, and he doesn't really even know exactly what that means. He just knows that he's calling him to follow him, right? And so you look at this passage too, and if you noticed, it says he was the 12th team. So there were 12 teams of oxen, and Elisha was plowing the 12th team. Maybe you're thinking, why does it mention that? Why make note that he had the 12th team? Well, I was wondering the same thing, and essentially it probably meant that his team, or maybe he himself, was likely the smallest or the youngest. And so they're going last of all the teams because of that. So you think about how God likes to call sometimes those that we wouldn't necessarily pick first based on appearances or looks, but God looks at the heart, kind of like with King David. The same type of situation. Maybe Elisha wasn't the one that would be the most cut out for the job, but God saw potential in him through Elijah and called him to that. And so he recognized that, and he wasn't hesitating in following after that. And so Elisha has already decided from that moment that he leaves the plow and leaves his team of oxen that he's going to go, right? He just asked for the opportunity to say goodbye to his parents, which maybe you could see that as a hesitation. I don't, because those are his loved ones, those closest to him. I'm sure there were other people, countless other people that he could think of to say goodbye. Chances are, if you were leaving town or you knew you were going to be gone for a while, you probably would want to say goodbye to more people than just mom and dad, right? So I see that as his willingness and readiness to just go. He wants to just say goodbye to mom and dad. That's it. And then beyond that, he's ready to go and follow Elijah. So when you recognize God's calling, be like Elisha and be decisive and just go, no matter what it means you might be leaving behind. There's a lot of things that could get in the way of that we want to cling to and not give up to follow God's calling, but nothing is going to compare or be worth what it is that God's calling you to. And the last thing we're going to wrap up with here tonight is don't turn back. There should be no turning back when you sense that call from God. It's really important to consider what Elisha was giving up in pursuing that calling. So he's not only leaving behind that team of oxen in the field, but that also means leaving behind a wealthy family. If they have enough oxen, livestock was a sign of wealth, and they have this whole team of oxen, one of just 12 of them, right? So he probably had a family that was very well off, and he's clearly got this job, this role in the family that he can inherit, that he can keep going. So that's a significant thing to leave behind, especially back then. And so I wonder, why do we focus more on what we might lose than what we might gain when it comes to following God's calling or to do hard things? Why do you think that is? In the case of Elisha, it seems very clear that he wasn't focused on what he was going to lose, but instead on what he was going to gain in following God's calling to be with Elijah and following and learning after Elijah. So he not only decided to pursue that calling, but he leaves no doubt about his choice to do it, right? If you see what happens in the passage, he kills all of the oxen that were there driving the plow, and in order to offer them up as in a sacrificial type of way, and for the people to in the village to enjoy the oxen, the meat, he uses the plow that they were pulling as the fire to be able to cook them, right? So not only does he no longer have his team of oxen, but now he doesn't even have his plow. So his livelihood, the thing that he had been working so hard at, as soon as Elijah places that cloak on him, it doesn't matter anymore. He is leaving all of that, and he's not turning back. There's no going back now. The oxen are gone, the plow is gone. He is all in to follow God's calling. And that's the same kind of bold type of faith that we ought to have when we see God calling us to go do something, no matter what the cost might be. And so I have just, to wrap things up, just real quick, want to read some lyrics from a very powerful hymn, one that's really close to my heart, that I think you guys will enjoy. And it's from a hymn called I Have Decided to Follow Jesus. And it goes like this. I'm not going to read everything because it gets a little repetitive, but I wanted to hit some of the bigger lines within the song. I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back. Though none go with me, I still will follow. No turning back, no turning back. My cross I'll carry till I see Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. As we today, seeking to follow Jesus, think about Elisha and how he responded to God's call. My prayer is that we would have the same type of boldness, the same type of decisiveness, and the same type of attentiveness as Elisha, to be looking for, waiting, and listening for God's calling in the big things and in the small things. And when we sense that, when we know God is leading us to something, to just go after it, to pursue it, knowing that what God is calling us to is far greater and far more important than anything else we might be pursuing. Thanks, guys. Now it's time for you guys to head into your small group discussion, praying that God blesses your conversation tonight together.